Might be loud. I knew it might be a little loud today. All right. It's because if we get to it, I have a video to share with you, but I don't know that we'll get to it. I'm going to try. If I do, I got really, really far. Right. We are picking up at, here we go. Last week we talked about just why do we look to other ancient translations? Why don't we look just at the Hebrew? And we just talked about how there's many witnesses to what the original Hebrew said, starting with with the first set of copies, if you will, that would be contemporary with the original inspired word of God. And then we would have the final form produced by Ezra and his men, and then copies of that, and copies of those, and copies of those. And eventually the copies would wear out and we start getting translations, and we start getting a scattering of the Bible, both from Jews and Christians all around the world, and all around and on different languages as well. And so that was just a brief overview to kind of give you a sense of why we look to other witnesses, not just the Hebrew, but also translations that would have been copying from the Hebrew. As we spoke about last week, we have the Septuagint in the green there. They copied from the Hebrew, but the Old Latin in the blue there, they copied from the Septuagint and the Old Testament. We got the Targums that were copies from the Hebrew as well, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are Hebrew, and the Coptic. Last week I said I wasn't sure if the Coptic went with the Septuagint or the Hebrew. I couldn't remember, so I went back and looked. They did, in fact, go to the Septuagint. So, so on this chart here, as far as languages are concerned, at this point, before the Latin Vulgate comes on the scene, the only translation that's really translated directly from the Hebrew at this point is the Syriac Peshitta, which we already covered. And I'll mention the Syriac Peshitta again in a few moments. But so at this point, if you are reading the Old Testament, whether you're reading it in Latin, Coptic, whether you're reading it in Latin or Coptic, the other option is that you read it directly from the Greek itself. Everyone's reading from the Septuagint for the most part, except the Syriac Christians. They are reading from the Hebrew. So unless you speak Hebrew, or Syriac, you aren't getting a Hebrew Bible, generally speaking. And then the Latin Vulgate comes on the scene, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But this is a sense of just an idea of all the textual witnesses. And I thought this would be a good idea too, because some people ask me if somehow the manuscripts that I have up there represented like direction as well, as if the Septuagint's in the West and the Syriac is in the East. Well, kind of, not really. I wasn't thinking of direction when I put this together. I was just using the blank space I had on the page, and that's the way it worked out. So if you want more of like, where were these being used? I decided to do a rough idea of the reach of the early translations. And so if we go to this chart here, the Septuagint in green, you'll see this is the area in which the Septuagint was widely used. All right, it would have started here somewhere in Alexandria, Egypt, and be finished in Israel. And this is the somewhat of the reach of the Septuagint in its day. And then the Syriac Peshitta, this one's really interesting. I'm going to circle back to the Peshitta in a second. And then we have the Coptic down here, small section Coptic. We didn't talk about any Coptic translations, and the reason being is because they're not as impactful on Christianity. It's a small group of Christians speaking a language that is pretty much spoken by a small group of people. It's not a common tongue. It was just really localized to a small area. They still are important witnesses for us today, but we have so much from the Peshitta, from the Septuagint, and other translations, including the Latin, that it doesn't give us as much information. So we don't lean a lot on the Coptic. So it gives us a little bit less of a textual witness. If you're following me on Facebook, I posted a video last week, I think, of a Coptic ordination service. I thought it was interesting, so I just posted it. I didn't give any commentary. But there was an ordination service for a particular priest, and it was done in Coptic. There's still the Ethiopian eunuch, not Ethiopian eunuch, Ethiopian Orthodox church as well. They use the Coptic, and they still use the Coptic language. They don't go to the vernacular. They're using the Coptic language. They're using the Ethiopian Bibles, not vernacular translations, and they are still attempting to teach people the Coptic so that they can read the Bible in Coptic. So that's that. And then you see here, the Latin Vulgate has a very wide range. The Roman Empire is really what's driving this in the Latin language. So you see they cover a lot of area. Now, the Syriac Peshitta is very interesting. We'll do a little bit of church history here today too. Let's see, sometime in the 5th century. So again, contemporary with Jerome, there was a man by the name of Nestorius, and he would have lived in this general area right here, roughly, okay? I'm not super good with geography, but I'm doing my best here. All right, so he would have lived in this area here, and actually, I'm gonna change this. There we go. So he lived in this general area here, and he had an interesting view of the nature of God and the nature of Jesus. We would affirm as Trinitarians that God is 3 persons in one nature. Okay, 3 persons in one nature. He held an opposite view. He held that God was 1 person with 3 natures. Eventually, this went to a council. Nestorius was deemed a heretic, and he was exiled from his place here, which would have been in the Byzantine Empire. He was exiled from here to west of Egypt, okay? But he had a following. He had a following that began to start churches, and that following took their Syriac Peshittas, whether they took it from just south of him or they took it from here, we're not exactly sure. But the Syriac Peshitta, we find manuscripts of the Syriac Peshitta going all the way to China. All the way to China. We have found Syriac Peshitta manuscripts there. There was a Nestorian missionary who went to China in about the early 8th century, early 7th century, mid 7th century. And he became, so I used to play a game when I was a kid. I still play it occasionally when I have time, which is very rare. It was called Dynasty Warriors when I was a kid. And then what it is, it's a video game reconstructing the history of China. All right. And the game starts in roughly early 200 AD and finishes around 600 AD. So it's about a 300-year history that you're playing through. And you're a conquering empire, conquering other empires, and you end up changing history depending on which empire you choose to start with, because your empire may not have actually made it. So it starts with the Han Dynasty, breaks down into 3 kingdoms, Jin, Wei, Shu, and Wu. Those kingdoms fight each other. Wei falls, Jin rises, Jin falls, and the Tang Dynasty rises. The Tang Dynasty is where this missionary shows up. And this missionary shows up and he becomes very friendly with the emperor. Christianity began to flourish greatly in this area. It was really flourishing quite well. The emperor was promoting it. So in China, we had a huge flux of Christianity in the 7th century, 7th and 8th century. And sometime during the 10th century, during the, oh man, did I write it in my notes? I don't remember what dynasty it was, but the Tang Dynasty collapsed and a new dynasty took its place. That new dynasty, we don't know what happened, but seemingly Christianity just goes away. It's still there, very small pockets, but nobody is aware of it. It's almost gone. And we had multiple missionaries throughout the Middle Ages and then during post-Reformation going to China, thinking China is an unreached country. They're the first to go there. And when they show up, they would find pockets of churches. They're like, where did these churches come from? And we had no idea. We had no idea where they were coming from until 1635. We found what's called the Xi'an stele, Xi'an stele, Xi apostrophe AN, if you want to look it up later, the Xi'an stele. And on that Xi'an stele, you have this, let's see, get my cursor over here. You have this writing here in Chinese. And on the back side, or on the front side, this writing in Chinese is the story of the religion called the Light, which is Christianity. And the story of the missionary who came, his friendship with the emperor, everything I just told you. This is how we found out what it was. It's the history of how Christianity came to China. On the back side, so on the front side is all Chinese characters. On the back side is translated in Syriac, just demonstrating that whoever came with the Syriac Bible as well. And we found manuscripts there. And we found manuscripts also in India. So missionaries would have started there. But that would have been the Nestorian church. And apparently the Nestorian church had a very downplayed view of what Nestorius would have held as his theology for the nature of God. Interesting history there. So that's all of that. And that gives you kind of a sense on the map, if you will, where these translations are reaching. Now, numerically, the Latin church is by far the largest. Okay, numerically, the Latin church is untouched in numbers. Geographically, the Syriac would be the largest geographically. We had more churches going further out in the Syriac than in other translations. All right. And yeah, same thing. The Eastern, as the Eastern churches start to break off from the Western churches, you'll have the Eastern Orthodox Church, you'll have the Greek Orthodox Church, and you'll have Syriac Orthodox Church that all fall into the Eastern Orthodox category. The translations differ slightly. The Syriac churches still use the Syriac Peshitta to this day in Syriac, not in English. Again, they don't translate into the vernacular languages. All right, so we start with the Latin Vulgate. We gave a brief history of what was happening, how Latin started becoming the lingua franca, how Christians were just translating their Septuagint and their Greek texts into Latin. And there was all sorts of Latin Bibles, lots of them, to the degree that not all of them were good. All right, it wasn't a situation where we had a lot of good translations and everyone was using a good translation. We had a situation where we had a lot of translations. Some of them were good and some of them were bad. And the people were not educated enough to know which was which. So they wanted Jerome to standardize it. All right, we talked about Bishop, what's his name? Did I write it here? I'm pretty sure I did. Maybe I didn't. We talked about, I'm not going to go over them again, but we talked about early church fathers, Tertullian, Cyprian. And then we talked about, man, where's the bishop? There it is, Damasus. I knew I wrote it down. Bishop Damasus. Bishop Damasus was Jerome's. Actually, you know what? I'm going to go back to that map for a second, just to give you an idea. Bishop Damasus is in Rome, okay? And that is where Jerome starts. Jerome starts in Rome, okay? And Bishop Damasus tells Jerome we should do a Latin translation of the Bible. You should do it. You're educated enough. Remember, Jerome could speak Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac, and other translations, as well as other languages, as well as Latin. So he's well versed in multiple languages. He was highly educated, and people thought he was the best man to do the job. So what Jerome does, though, is he leaves Rome and he travels to Israel to do his work. So he's in Israel when he does his work. We're going to talk about Augustine. Okay, Augustine is going to be in northern Africa in Egypt. Probably Alexandria is where Augustine is. All right. And so just to give you kind of an idea of where they are when we start having this conversation. All right. Talked about Tertullian, Cyprian, Latin Vulgate. We talked about the KJV translators to the reader, how they give us the history of the Latin Vulgate there. And they tell us about Jerome's let's see, right here. This motivated Jerome, a highly learned father who is without controversy considered the best linguist up to and in his own era. High praise from the KJV translators for Jerome. Okay. And then we read that Jerome also said in his prologue to Joshua, there are as many text forms as there are books, and everyone has either added or subtracted whatever seemed right to him according to his judgment. So Jerome's goal here is to standardize the Latin translations. And he does a couple of things that are worth noting. One, he's doing a revision versus a virgin work. What's that mean is with regard to the New Testament, he doesn't start from scratch. He takes what he seems are the best Latin translations. He compares them to the original, and he just updates them where he thinks they went wrong or weren't as clear. All right. He distinguishes between formal and functional translations, preferring the latter, functional. He's more concerned about the Latin conveying the meaning than he is about trying to stick close to the original text. He wants it to be understood. And so he says a literal translation from one language to another obscures the sense. So he does not want to do a word-for-word translation. All right. So when we look at his translation philosophy, the Latin Vulgate, as Jerome does it, will fall somewhere in the same category as what we would say the NIV is. Okay, that's about where Jerome's Latin Vulgate is with regard to translation philosophy. All right, and then the third thing he does, and this was a big deal, is he prioritizes the Hebrew over the Septuagint. Now, I already explained this, and I explained it last week too. The Septuagint was what everyone was using, unless you were reading the Syriac or you were reading Hebrew. And most people didn't speak Hebrew back then. Hebrew was a very esoteric language for a small group of people, primarily Hebrews, and not all Hebrews either. Most Hebrews still were speaking Greek or Aramaic. They would have been reading from the Hebrew if they're reading the Septuagint, because it's translated from the Hebrew, or they would have been reading the Syriac Peshitta, which was translated from the Hebrew. But everyone else is reading just the Greek, right? So they're reading the Septuagint exclusively, not the Hebrew, and they're reading translations from the Septuagint. So a translation of a translation. Jerome says, I don't want to do that. I want to go back to the fountain. That's what he says. I want to go back to the fountain. I want to go to the truth. I want to go right from the Hebrew. And this is a big deal in his day. Everyone's using the Septuagint. That is the received text of their day. They want the Septuagint translated. And so Augustine begins to push back. So Augustine, we just saw him when we talked about canons, right? Canon, when it came to canon philosophy, Augustine wanted the Septuagint to define the canon as well. And there were certain books that the Septuagint has that Augustine didn't affirm. But generally speaking, Augustine held to a different canon than Jerome, and Jerome held to the Hebrew. He had Hebrew priority. So that was with regard to the canon, and Jerome held it with regard to the text. Okay, not just the books, but the text within the books. We're going to stick with the Hebrew. Augustine is not happy with this. Augustine has been using the Septuagint his whole life. It's what he knows. So this is a break in tradition. This is a break in tradition in church history as well. The church has primarily been using the Septuagint as their source text. And so Augustine and Jerome start to correspond with each other. And this is where we left off last week, and we're going to get into their correspondence. I'm going to read a good portion of the first letter first, and then I'm going to try to do summaries after that, because some of these can get pretty lengthy. But the first letter really gives us a sense of the dialogue that's going to happen. And we'll get to read how they talk to each other too. So Augustine in 393 AD, he writes this to Jerome. I beseech you not to devote your labor to the work of translating into Latin the sacred canonical books, unless you follow the method in which you have translated Job, with the addition of notes to let it be seen plainly what differences there are between this version and yours and that of the Septuagint, whose authority is worthy of highest esteem. For my own part, I cannot sufficiently express my wonder that anything should at this date be found in the Hebrew manuscripts which escaped so many translators perfectly acquainted with the language. I say nothing of the 70 regarding whose harmony in mind and spirit surpassing that which is found in even one man. I dare not in any way pronounce a decided opinion, except that in my judgment, beyond question, very high authority must in this work of translation be conceded to them, the Septuagint. I am more perplexed by those translators who, though enjoying the advantage of laboring after the 70, had completed their work, and although well acquainted, as it is reported, with the force of Hebrew words and phrases, and with Hebrew syntax, have not only failed to agree among themselves, but have left many things which, even after so long a time, still remain to be discovered and brought to light. Now, these things were either obscure or plain. If they are obscure, it is believed that you are as likely to have been mistaken as others. If they were plain, it is not believed that they, the 70, could possibly have been mistaken. Having stated the grounds of my perplexity, I appeal to your kindness to give me an answer regarding this matter. So, in summary, Augustine is saying that the 72 translators of the Septuagint are highly respected scholars. They know the Hebrew very well. The Hebrew manuscripts that he complains says there's too many differences among them. We have so many differences. How are you going to be able to determine the differences from them that the 70 couldn't do? And if it's obscure, if you have an issue with obscurity in the Hebrew manuscripts, the 70 would have resolved it. And if it was plain, how are you going to do better than the 70? All right? How are you going to do better than the 70 that did it? So he's really just pushing hard on the fact that the Septuagint, there's no reason to move away from the Septuagint. It's perfectly good. That's his opinion. And keep in mind, there was a belief in that day, if you were following the letter of Erastus, which they had access to, remember the theory was the 72 went into multiple rooms and they came out with perfect copies of the Septuagint. Everyone agreed entirely. They believed the Septuagint was the inspired translation of the day. All right. And so Augustine wants to weigh really, really heavily on the Septuagint as being divinely, he doesn't use the words divinely inspired here, but at least divinely authorized. All right. And it was authorized by the Greek king in Egypt as well. So very fascinating stuff. So a couple of things I want to just point out here. A key point from this letter, Augustine wants to continue the practice of writing footnotes. He says, I want to see where you made changes from the original text. Give me footnotes. Let me know where you followed the Hebrew instead of the Septuagint. I agree with him on that point, although we're going to see that Augustine's logic is a little flawed in a minute. And then he also suggests that this LXX scholars, the Septuagint scholars, were well-versed in Hebrew, and he favors their scholarship over that of Jerome. Now, what's interesting, he actually says a line in here. Let's see if I did highlight it. Because I wanted to grab this, and I don't remember if I highlighted it. Yes. Okay. I say nothing of the 70 regarding whose harmony in mind and spirit. That's the fact that they came out of the room with a single translation, surpassing that which is found in even one man. We're going to talk about this later, much later in translation philosophy, but I tend to actually agree with Augustine on this point, that a council of translators is better than a translation done by one man. Okay, there's a bit of safety in numbers. Augustine makes a good point here. However, the view of many in this day is there was really nobody else that could do this work, as well as Jerome. All right, and then the last thing, Augustine's third point is in support of the second. He suggests that if the Hebrew is difficult or obscure, that the unfamiliar words would be handled by the 70 translators because they were Jewish speakers translating into Greek. So they were well-versed in both Greek and Hebrew. So 10 years pass. He writes this letter and Jerome doesn't respond. 10 years pass. In that 10 years, he writes another letter. I'm not going to read to you that letter. There's no reason to. He writes another letter because he's going to reiterate what he's going to say anyway. Jerome doesn't respond. So 10 years later, Augustine writes a third letter. That's the letter we're going to read now. And so this is what he says. To my venerable Lord Jerome, my esteemed and holy brother and fellow presbyter, Augustine sends greetings in the Lord. Never since I began to write to you, and to long for your writing in return, have I met with a better opportunity for our exchange of communications than now, when my letter is to be carried to you by a most faithful servant and minister of God, who is also a dear friend of mine, namely our son Cyprian, the deacon. Through him, I expect to receive a letter from you with all the certainty which is the matter of this kind possible. For the son whom I have named will not have been found wanting in respect of zeal in asking, or persuasive influence in obtaining a reply from you, nor will he fail in diligently keeping, promptly bearing, and faithfully delivering the same. I only pray that if I be in any way worthy of this, the Lord may give his help and favor to your heart and to my desire, so that no higher will may hinder that which your brotherly goodwill inclines you to do. So what he says is, I've written you a letter twice now, and he's going to continue. This is not the full letter, so I'm just going to summarize what he says. He says, I've written you a letter. Now I'm writing you a third letter, and I'm delivering it by someone I trust, Cyprian. And I expect he's going to return with a letter from you. And he's not going to leave until he persuades you to write a letter for me. And so no pressure there, Jerome. I've sent my enforcer. Okay. And Augustine goes to explain that he did send 2 letters, but he's giving him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they never reached you. So with Cyprian, I've sent copies of the previous 2 letters so that you may review them and give me a response to those first 2 letters. He goes on again about the footnotes. He wants to see the footnotes because he believes he's looking at Jerome's translation of Job. He sees footnotes where they're departing from the Septuagint, and he wants footnotes that way to continue to let him know where the Old Testament is departing from the Septuagint. He wants more of those footnotes. He only has Job. That's the only, well, he's going to reference another book in a minute. So he has Job and at least one other book. I don't know what else he has because those are the only 2 he mentions. He goes on to defend the authority of the Greek Septuagint, like he just did over that of the Hebrew manuscripts. So he's reiterating that. He argues that because so few people speak Hebrew, so this is a key point. Remember, not a lot of people spoke Hebrew. That there are so few people that speak Hebrew that if Jerome disagrees with the Septuagint translators on what a word means, there's no one to arbitrate the difference. Jerome is on an island by himself. And then he argues that there is a word in the book of Jonah that Jerome translated in such a way that when the bishop of a particular church read that passage to his people, they went into an uproar. And the bishop almost lost his job as a bishop. The people almost kicked him out. And so this bishop, attempting to save his skin and put the people at ease, went to a nearby Jewish community and asked them if Jerome had translated the word appropriately. And the Jewish community confirmed that Jerome did not translate the word correctly. And Augustine is letting him know that. And so in other words, your translation is so bad, a pastor, a bishop, almost lost his job over it. The people knew what it should have said, and you got it wrong. And then Augustine's letter ends with commending Jerome's work in the Gospels, saying that he found nothing worthy to raise in objection. That it was a great translation in the New Testament, having come from the Greek. Then he goes back and says, but your work is so good in the Gospels. Even if I did find a mistake, I would overlook it because of how good it is. Then he goes back to the Old Testament and says, not the case in the Old Testament. You need to translate from the Greek. And so that's that. Let's see here. Then he writes this at the end of his letter. I thought that this letter was to be a short one, but it has somehow been as pleasant to me to go on with this as if I were talking with you. I conclude with entreating you by the Lord kindly to send me a full reply, and thus give me, so far as is in your power, the pleasure of your presence. So thanks for listening to me. Sorry the letter was so long. Please reply. Jerome. Jerome replies to Augustine. And Jerome, I was literally giggling at home as I began to read Jerome's letter. So we'll read a small portion of Jerome's letter. And he says, you ask why a former translation which I made of some canonical books was carefully marked with asterisks and obelisks, whereas I afterwards published a translation without these. You must pardon my saying, you seem to me not to understand the matter. For the former translation is from the Septuagint, and wherever the obelisks are placed, they are designed to indicate that the 70 have said more than what is found in the Hebrew. But the asterisks indicate where what has been added by Origen from the version of Theodotion. So remember, this is helpful that we went back and we talked about the Septuagint and the various translations, the various manuscripts of it, Theodotion, Origen, Symmachus, and all of those. And in this case, he says the Septuagint, the Theodotion here. So he says, I have, so you need to understand, before Jerome did the Latin Vulgate from the Hebrew, he'd already done another translation in the Latin. And it is in the, he'd already done another translation from the Septuagint. So he has two translations out there, one from the Septuagint and one from the Hebrew. In the Septuagint version is the version he has all of his footnotes. And the footnotes aren't where the Hebrew departs from the Greek. It's where the Greek departs from the Greek. It's where he's seeing textual variants in different Septuagint manuscripts. And he's marking the textual variants. So he's saying, hey, well, it does depart from the Hebrew. Where I put in obelisks, it's departing from the Hebrew. It's saying more than the Hebrew says. Where I put in asterisks, it's because they don't agree with each other. And so I'm writing what Origen wrote. And so he continues. I find this interaction so intriguing. Oh, no, he doesn't continue. That's my notes. Sorry, that's my notes. I do find this interaction intriguing because Jerome doesn't stop there. He goes on to further say this, what he's talking about. He suggests that Augustine doesn't know what he's talking about because he doesn't know a Greek translation when he holds it in his hands. The first one I sent to you, or the first one you have in your hands, is a translation from the Greek. You're asking me to translate from the Septuagint. I did. It's in your hands. That's what you're looking at. So he just starts slamming him on that point. And he says, I'm surprised that you're not reading the Septuagint from the fountains. In other words, he's suggesting that there's more than one Septuagint out there. And he's not reading the earliest one, the best one. He's reading some corrupted one from Origen. That's his claim. So he starts hitting him with that. He says, if he wants to read the genuine LXX, to be a true admirer of the LXX or the Septuagint, he says, then ignore the readings that come after the asterisks. So if you want to read the Septuagint as the Septuagint is in Latin, you want to read it in Latin, then don't read whatever comes after the asterisk because that's added. And then Jerome answers the charge that if there was something obscure that the LXX translators would have resolved, and they didn't, Jerome is not in a better place to resolve it, according to Augustine. Jerome answers that charge by saying this. He says, Christian commentators throughout church history have been working with obscure passages all along, and they write commentaries attempting to resolve these obscure passages. And he says, this is what we do. And then he says and then he gives a list of all the different authoritative commentaries that they had been using, people that thought these were well respected. And he quotes only the ones that are commentaries in the book of Psalms. And he does this on purpose to lay the groundwork for his next comment, which is, you also wrote a commentary for the book of Psalms. And if it was plain, and if it was obscure, all of the Christian fathers before you would have resolved it. Who are you to think you could resolve an obscurity better than they did? They were closer. And then he says, and if it was plain, then there's no purpose in you doing it. They got it right. So in other words, he starts throwing it back on him. This is what we do. We work with obscure passages. We sometimes disagree with those who came before us, and we work through it. And you've done it, Augustine. You do this too. Either I'm in a position that I'm able to disagree with those who have gone before me, just like you are, or neither of us are, and we're both wasting our time. And we should not do any more study because it's all been resolved by everybody before us. This is Jerome's argument. I was like, oh man, so good. So he says, if Psalms are obscure, then Augustine is just as likely to be mistaken as others. But if they are plain, it is incredible that all the commentators before Augustine had got it wrong. And if either of these be the case, then it is useless for Augustine to write on Psalms at all. And then he says, in other words, to Jerome, it's a never-ending work. This is what Christians are always going to do. We're never going to stop. We'll always be engaged in doing our best to interpret the obscure, and we ought to be at liberty to work through these issues. This is Jerome's place. Jerome then picks up on the issue of Augustine's vague charge at mistranslating a word with such significance that it almost caused the fall of an unnamed bishop and his church. Now, this is what Jerome has to say about that. You tell me that I have given a wrong translation of some word in Jonah, and that a worthy bishop narrowly escaped losing his charge through the clamorous tumult of his people, which was caused by a different rendering of this word. At the same time, you withhold from me what that word was, which I mistranslated, thus taking away the possibility of my saying anything in my own vindication, lest my reply should be fatal to your objection. However, so I love this. So Jerome's like, you didn't even tell me what the word was. It was so poorly mistranslated, you kept from me the word itself so that I would not be able to reply to it, because my reply would probably be fatal to your objection. And so Jerome's no idiot, though. He thinks he knows what the word is because he's familiar with the controversies. This isn't the first time. So despite the fact that Augustine chose not to tell him what the word was, he goes on to consider what that word might be. So the word is in that Jerome suspects is found in Jonah 4:6. Okay, and so in Jonah 4:6, if you read the next translation of the Septuagint, you'll see, and that the Lord God ordered a gourd, and it came up over Jonah's head, to be a shade over his head, to shade him from his miseries. And they transliterate the Greek in this one, so I'm trying to read it, and I'm not doing a great job. Jonah was happy with great happiness about the gourd. The Douay Rheims, this is a English translation of the Latin Vulgate, reads this way. This is how Jerome would have written it in Latin. And the Lord God prepared an ivy, and it came up over the head of Jonah, to be a shadow over his head and to cover him, for he was fatigued. And Jonah was exceeding glad of the ivy. The issue being gourd versus ivy. Augustine is going to take this translation difficulty, and he's going to use this to pound Jerome over and over to discredit Jerome as a scholar, that he chose to use ivy instead of gourd. This is a big deal. I'll talk about why in a moment. So this is what Jerome says. Perhaps it was the old dispute about gourd, which has been revived after slumbering many long years, brought against me the charge of giving in my translation the word ivy instead of gourd. I've already given a sufficient answer to this in my commentary on Jonah. At present, I deem it enough to say that in the passage where the Septuagint has gourd, and Aquila and others have rendered the word ivy, so he's quoting other Septuagint writers, Aquila and others, the Hebrew manuscript has sission, which in the Syriac language is now spoken sissia. It is a kind of shrub with large leaves like a vine, and when planted, it quickly springs up to the size of a small tree, standing upright on its own stem, without requiring any poles or canes, as both gourds and ivy do. If, therefore, in translating word for word, I had put sissia, no one would know what it meant. If I'd used the word gourd, I would have said that which was not found in the Hebrew. Therefore, I put down ivy, that I might not differ from other translators. But if your Jews, either through malice or ignorance, as you suggest yourself, that the word is in the Hebrew text, which is found in the Greek and Latin versions, it is evident that they were either unacquainted with the Hebrew or have been pleased to say what is not true in order to make sport of the gourd planters. So the gourd planters was a derogatory term for those who believed in literal translations and that gourd be necessary, a necessary translation, and that's translated any other way would be wrong. So a few takeaways from this one. Jerome, even though he's translating in a formal way, he's still concerned about accuracy, right? He could have translated it Sicyon, and he says no one would understand what that meant. It would be accurate, but no one would know what that means. He says, so I translated it ivy because that's what Aquila did. And it's close enough. It's close enough that people will know what it is, even though if it's not exactly the same plant, but it's the same kind of plant. So they'll get the sense. So Jerome's very careful about doing this. Jerome ends the letter. Oh, and he says this too about the Jews, which was hysterical to me. He says the Jews had Augustine was claiming that the Jews had corrupted the Hebrew text, that they were malicious in corrupting the Hebrew text. But when they wanted to question Jerome's translation, they went to the Jews. And so he says, well, either they lied to you, like you said they do, or they just weren't acquainted with the Hebrew. Those were the two options that Jerome gave back. They were either wrong unintentionally, or they were wrong intentionally. But in either case, Augustine, according to your arguments, they're always wrong. And so I'm right. So I thought that was pretty funny. And he raises that double standard. Okay, so why is this a big deal? I'm going to try to cover this in the last few minutes. Why gourd is a big deal, okay? Why make such a big deal? If we talked about two different plants in the garden, all right, and we're trying to translate it, and we chose one plant over maybe a more accurate one, in the case of the book of Jonah, what difference does it make? Why make such a big deal over the kind of plant, okay? Well, the gourd's important to the early church. Gourds were used by pilgrims as symbols of God's providence of care and sovereignty, as recounted in Jonah's life. Okay, so Jonah was in a position that he needed help from God. God provided the gourd, and so this became a symbol of their view of God's sovereignty and provision. So when pilgrims would travel, they would travel with gourd-shaped water jugs. Okay, this is a big deal, symbolically speaking. Another reason, in Jonah's story, was interpreted very allegorically, that the gourd prefigured the death of the Messiah and the salvation of the people, that it sprang up quickly and then died. And so they would say this is a pre-incarnate type of Christ. And so the gourd became a symbol of the coming Messiah, of the coming Christ, okay? And so I think it's kind of cool that they go that direction, but I think it stretches the text too far because it leaves, one, the plant stays dead, two, it's not the purpose of the story at all. It's not the purpose of what God is trying to get across to Jonah himself. So interesting, but I think it falls short. But this is a reason why gourds were really important. It was viewed as symbolically the coming Messiah. And then thirdly, due to the last interpretation, the gourd plant not only signified the death of Christ, but also his resurrection because it came up quickly. So it represented both his life on earth and his life after. They had two meanings for it, okay? And so what's really interesting is here, this fruit is the apple. The apple signified the fall of man, and the gourd represented the rise of Christ, okay, or the redemption of man. So the gourd was very heavy, had a heavy weight of symbology applied to it. It was used frequently in their preaching, and they had gourds around. It was constant memory. So to change it from gourd to ivy ruined all of their symbology. Right? It'd be the same thing if I said Jesus, the fish symbol is wrong. It wasn't actually a fish. right? We didn't have a fish. And so all of our Christian symbols of fish would be mistaken. Or worse yet, like the Jehovah's Witnesses do. The cross isn't right. The cross is wrong. It's actually a stake. And so we'll talk about that in maybe a different class. But anyway, imagine having all of our symbology of what we look at for the Messiah or Christianity being changed because of a translation, right? You'd be like, no way. That's what's happening here. Augustine's very upset, and as would be the people sitting in the pews when they hear the word ivy instead of gourd, when they put all this weight on. So we'll stop there. We'll pick up with Jerome's close of his letter next week and the ending of their argument, and we'll finish up the Latin Vulgate next week as well. But as you can see, their translation debate continues, and we'll wrap it up next week. All right, you all are dismissed. Thank you.